Your next grocery bill isn't just higher because of normal inflation. It's actually a direct downstream casualty of a military blockade halfway across the world. And the data shows it's hitting your morning staples harder than almost anything else. We're looking at a completely invisible domino effect that is quietly reshaping the global economy and your personal budget right this second. Just look at the latest official numbers that dropped. April's consumer price index just totally shattered the stable pricing patterns we've been seeing for the past year. We hit a 3.8% headline inflation rate, which officially registers as the sharpest one-month acceleration in retail grocery costs in nearly 4 years. Now, you might walk through the dairy aisle, see egg prices dropping, and think, okay, maybe we're getting a break. But that's just a temporary recovery from the avian flu. It's totally deceptive. The broader food index actually jumped 0.7% in a single month. 5 out of the 6 primary grocery categories the government tracks spiked at the exact same time. This isn't just one bad harvest. It is a massive systemic shock.
And what's really wild is that economists are trying to untangle this crisis while staring into a massive blind spot. Because of the late 2025 federal government shutdown, official CPI data for October and November of that year literally does not exist. The lapse in appropriations means those numbers are permanently unavailable. So we are flying partially blind into one of the most complicated pricing environments in a decade.
So, to understand why this happens so fast, you have to connect the grocery aisle back to the geopolitical conflict in Iran. Military strikes and regional instability effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. And you might be wondering, why does a maritime corridor thousands of miles away matter to your local supermarket? Well, roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and a third of the global fertilizer trade has to squeeze through that exact strait. That bottleneck triggered an instant, violent supply-side energy shock. It sent Brent crude spiking to over $120 a barrel, and the timing literally couldn't have been worse. This hit right smack in the middle of the critical North American planting season. Modern farming runs on diesel. Tractors, harvesters, irrigation, they all need it. This sudden oil spike left domestic farmers facing operating expenses that completely derailed their planting schedules.
But actually growing the food is only half the battle. Think about what I call the perishable freight tax. Fresh food has to move in refrigerated, diesel-powered trucks. With the national average for diesel hitting $5.67 a gallon and actually blowing past $7 on the West Coast, freight rates absolutely surged. Food manufacturers have already exhausted their margins over the last few years. They're backed into a corner, which means they are forced to pass these extreme transport expenses straight to your receipt.
Which brings us to the most extreme anomaly sitting on the shelf right now: fresh tomatoes. They just jumped an incredible 15% in a single month. Annually, we are looking at nearly a 40% price spike. And this isn't just baseline inflation. It's this unprecedented convergence of crises hitting one single commodity all at once. Let's trace this perfect storm. It started in December when extreme heat completely decimated Mexico's harvest. Then in January, a brutal winter frost swept through Florida, wiping out up to 80% of field crops in certain regions. By February, skyrocketing utility costs forced Northeast greenhouse operators to essentially shut down because they literally couldn't afford to run their grow lights. And by April, all those dominoes fell, hitting the consumer with a massive price surge. But what's truly staggering here is the policy response. At the exact moment the U.S. market desperately needed a safety valve for supply, structural trade barriers kicked in. The U.S. imposed a 17.09% anti-dumping tariff on most Mexican tomato imports. This created massive financial uncertainty for Mexican growers, discouraged them from planting more, and effectively choked off the last remaining international supply line we had. This created a really fascinating contradiction between political rhetoric and hard economic data. Mexico's president claimed that businesses were just redirecting their tomatoes to the U.S. to chase higher profits, despite the tariff, arguing that's what drove up domestic Mexican prices. But data from Banco de Mexico completely exposed a different reality. Their official numbers showed a 23.5% drop in export volume to the U.S., the lowest level since 2017. The data proves this isn't about greedy businesses shifting trade. It's a fundamental, physical lack of supply. And hey, if you're relying on your morning coffee to process all of this, the news isn't any better there. Non-alcoholic beverages saw massive upward pressure, with coffee costing nearly 20% more than it did this time last year. This is not a temporary blip. Your morning brew is caught in a global chokehold, and it's structurally hitting both Arabica and Robusta beans at the exact same time. The climate data driving the scarcity is just stark. Between 2021 and 2025, Brazil experienced an average of 70 extra coffee-harming heat days every single year. The global top 5 producers averaged 57 extra heat days. Add in a severe drought in Vietnam, triggering international panic buying, and you have a mess. Then, take all that scarce coffee and try to ship it. Red Sea shipping detours are forcing vessels to completely bypass the Suez Canal, sailing all the way around Africa, which is massively inflating ocean freight rates. Okay, but we really need to land the plane on the human impact here, because this does not hit everyone equally. The pressure is entirely asymmetric. For the highest earners, food is just 6.4% of their budget. For the middle class, it's about 12.2%. But for households in the lowest income bracket, food demands a staggering 33% of their pre-tax income. A 2.9% rise in grocery prices isn't an inconvenience for them. It's a devastating threat to basic nutritional security.
And this is all happening against a backdrop of real wage erosion. Think about your last raise. Even if your nominal hourly earnings grew by 3.6% over the last year, headline inflation of 3.8% totally swallowed it. The mathematical reality is that real purchasing power actually slid by 0.5%. Everyday workers literally have less purchasing power today than they did a year ago.
So how are people actually surviving this? Over 82% of US households are heavily leaning into aggressive budget coping strategies. They're trading down to lower-cost store brands, they're hunting for digital coupons like it's a part-time job, and planning meals strictly around weekly circulars. We're even seeing lower-income families driving miles out of their way to discount markets outside urban centers, just trying to absorb these macroeconomic shocks. Which brings us to a really critical tension in all of this. This sudden grocery price explosion is slamming families at the exact moment the safety net is being pulled out from under them. Under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025, federal food assistance is currently undergoing its most severe funding reduction in 60 years. We're talking about a 20% systemic cut. The human cost of that policy is staggering, $4.95 million. That's the number of people who plummeted out of national SNAP enrollment between early 2025 and 2026. This massive contraction is the direct result of strict new work requirements being expanded to older demographics, coupled with the elimination of crucial exemptions for highly vulnerable populations. But there's also a hidden legal mechanism inside that 2025 legislation that you really need to know about. It's called the Thrifty Food Plan Freeze. This law strictly prohibits non-cost neutral updates to benefits, meaning it permanently detaches federal assistance from real-world retail inflation. Because of this freeze, in 99% of U.S. counties right now, the maximum benefit no longer covers a modest meal. It creates an average $53 monthly shortfall per household, pushing unimaginable strain onto local food banks. And this opens up a massive new crisis for state budgets. Historically, the federal government and states split administrative costs for these programs 50-50. But the new framework mandates that by 2027, the state's share jumps to 75%. Washington is steadily transferring the cost burden downward. That's going to heavily pressure flat state revenues, and it could easily force local governments to cut enrollment support even further.
So zoom out for a second. All of this creates a massive dilemma for the newly appointed Federal Reserve Chairman, Kevin Warsh. The macroeconomic baseline has shifted to what economists are calling stagflation light. We've got persistent inflation, negative real wage growth, and decelerating economic output, with U.S. GDP forecasts being revised down from 2.4% to a sluggish 1.7%.
This perfectly illustrates the Federal Reserve's brutal bind. Standard monetary policy tools, like hiking interest rates, are designed to crush consumer demand, but they are structurally completely ineffective at fixing physical supply shocks. The Fed cannot magically reopen a blockaded shipping lane in the Middle East. They cannot thaw a frozen tomato crop in Florida. Yet they still have to consider rate hikes just to prevent a catastrophic wage price spiral. Which leads us to a really frustrating forward-looking reality. Agricultural economists call it asymmetric price stickiness. It's basically the economic phenomenon where retail grocery prices shoot up incredibly fast when wholesale inputs rise, but they fall much, much slower when the crisis actually resolves. And I really want you to remember this insight. Supply shocks can spike grocery prices in a single afternoon, but asymmetric price stickiness means your receipt stays expensive long after the crisis fades. Even if the conflict in the Middle East ends tomorrow and shipping lanes reopen, supply chains take months to work through their high-cost inventory of fertilizer and fuel.
Experts are projecting supermarket prices will remain painfully elevated for at least 12 to 18 months beyond the end of this current shock.
Which leaves us staring at a pretty massive, unresolved problem. If central banks can only manipulate demand through interest rates, how exactly does the Federal Reserve fight an inflation spike driven by weather and war without completely crushing the everyday consumer in the process?
An investment in knowledge pays the best interest, so why not invest in this channel? Click like and subscribe for more.